First story, taken under the stars, 1957, San Francisco de Sales, Minas Gerais. It started like any other night. I was out on my field, tending to some late planting under the moonlight. The nights here in the countryside are quiet, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional breeze passing through the crops. That night, though, there was something different in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the air was heavier, charged, almost. I remember looking up at the stars, thinking how unusually bright one of them seemed. It wasn't unusual for me to see stars brighter than others, but this one felt odd. It didn't twinkle like the others. It looked steady. At first I shrugged it off. Maybe it was a planet or something. But as I kept working, it started moving. Slowly at first, and then faster, like it was coming straight toward me. I froze, my heart pounding as this star grew larger and brighter, until it was clear that this wasn't a star at all. It was a light, a blinding, brilliant light hovering above my field. I swear my entire body screamed at me to run, but I just stood there, staring as this thing descended from the sky like nothing I'd ever seen before. It didn't take long for the object to land, if I can even call it that. It didn't make a sound, no roar of engines or anything like that, just silence, except for this faint hum that seemed to buzz in my chest. I could make out the shape now, oval, with a dome on top that caught the moonlight and glinted like polished metal. I don't know what I was expecting, but whatever it wasn't the hatch opening and a ramp extending down to the ground. That was when I panicked. I dropped my tools and bolted, thinking I could make it back to the house if I ran fast enough. But before I'd made it 10 steps, I felt something grab me. No hands, though. Nothing physical. It was like an invisible force clamped around me, holding me in place. I fought against it with everything I had, screaming and thrashing, but it was no use. That's when I saw them, 3 figures emerging from the light. They were small, no taller than my chest, with pale skin that almost glowed. Their heads were bigger than ours, their eyes small and slanted, and they wore these shiny, tight suits that reflected the light from the object. I'll never forget the way they moved, slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. They didn't speak, at least not out loud, but I swear I could feel their thoughts, like a buzzing in my head that wasn't mine. Before I knew it, they had me surrounded. I tried to swing at one, but my arms wouldn't move. My whole body was frozen, like I was paralyzed. They grabbed me. Or maybe I was pulled by that invisible force again. I can't say for sure. All I know is that I was being dragged toward the craft, my boots scraping the dirt as I tried to dig my heels in. The light from the object was so bright that it hurt to keep my eyes open, but I caught glimpses of the ramp as I was pulled inside. The air changed immediately. It was warmer, but not in a comforting way. It felt sterile, suffocating even, and the hum I'd heard earlier was louder, almost vibrating through my skull. They took me down a narrow corridor, their movements as calm as ever, while I was shaking so hard I thought my knees would give out. Then we stopped in front of a doorway that slid open without anyone touching it. Inside was a small room with smooth metallic walls and a strange bluish light that seemed to come from nowhere. That's when I realized I wasn't getting out of there anytime soon. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center, if you could even call it a chair. It was more like a slab of metal with curved edges, positioned at an angle. The beings guided me toward it, though again, it didn't feel like they were touching me. It was as if they were controlling my movements somehow. I struggled as much as I could, but my body wouldn't respond the way I wanted it to. They laid me back on the slab, and as soon as I was positioned, metallic restraints emerged from the sides, clamping over my wrists and ankles. My chest felt tight, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. One of them came closer, holding what looked like a long, thin rod with a glowing tip. I didn't understand what it was until they pressed it against my chin. The sharp sting shot through my face, and I felt warm blood trickling down my neck. They were taking my blood. I was sure of it. I clenched my teeth, tears streaming down the sides of my face as the device hummed against my skin. They worked, quickly, almost mechanically, as if this was routine for them. When they were done with the blood, they left me there, alone in the silence of that cold, sterile room. I remember thinking that maybe it was over, that maybe they'd just take whatever samples they wanted and let me go. But I was wrong. Oh, few minutes or maybe hours, I couldn't tell, passed before the door opened again. This time it wasn't one of the smaller beings that entered. It was her. She was taller than them, closer to my height, and her features were unsettlingly human, but not quite. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were much larger than normal, almond-shaped and dark. She had long white blonde hair that fell around her shoulders, and there was something about the way she moved, graceful, almost predatory, that made my stomach turn. She was wearing the same tight reflective suit as the others, but somehow on her, it seemed different, more deliberate. I wanted to look away, but her eyes locked onto mine, and it felt like she was staring straight into my soul. What happened next is the part I almost didn't want to write down. It's the part I wish I could forget, but I know I never will. She came closer, her gaze never leaving mine, until she was standing right over me. I felt the restraints loosen, but I couldn't move. Not because I didn't want to, but because something, her I think, was keeping me still. She reached out, her hand brushing against my chest, and though her touch was gentle, it sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like I was being studied, evaluated, and yet there was something else in her expression, something I can only describe as purpose. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, and before I knew it, she was climbing onto the slab with me. Everything after that is a blur of sensations and emotions that I still can't fully process. It wasn't violent, but it wasn't consensual either. It was like I was just there, a part of something I didn't understand. All I know is that when it was over, I felt empty, violated, and completely powerless. After whatever had just happened, I was left lying there, completely drained. My body felt like it had been wrung out, every muscle weak and trembling. She stood up, emotionless, and left the room without a word, if you could even call the way they communicated words. The door closed behind her with that same eerie silence, and for a few moments I thought I might actually be alone. But then the smaller beings returned. They moved quickly, unstrapping me from the slab and pulling me to my feet. My legs buckled beneath me, but they didn't seem to care. They just dragged me out of the room and back down the narrow hallway. At this point, I wasn't fighting anymore. I didn't have the strength, mentally or physically. I felt like I was floating in a daze, my mind trying and failing to make sense of what had just happened. I noticed the same hum in the walls, but it was louder now, almost deafening, like the whole ship was alive and reacting to something. They brought me to what looked like a hatch at the side of the craft. I didn't expect what happened next. Without warning, they just pushed me out. No explanation, no care for whether I landed on my feet or broke my neck, just a sudden forceful shove. I tumbled to the ground, landing hard on my side in the middle of my field. The wind was knocked out of me, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But then I felt the light again. That same blinding light from before was shining down on me, brighter and closer than ever. I rolled onto my back, shielding my face with my arms, and watched as the craft began to rise. It didn't make any noise except for that hum, which grew fainter the higher it went. Within seconds, it was just a speck in the sky, disappearing into the stars as quickly as it had arrived. And then, nothing. Just silence. The crickets were back, the breeze was back, and it was like the world had returned to normal. Except for me. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the sky and trying to piece together what had just happened. My whole body ached and my skin felt hot, like I'd been standing too close to a fire. When I finally managed to sit up, I noticed marks on my arms. Small, round burns, almost like cigarette burns. There were more on my chest and legs, but they didn't hurt as much as they looked. My head was pounding and my throat felt dry. But what scared me the most was the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even though the craft was gone, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from somewhere I couldn't see. I stumbled back to the house, barely able to stand, and locked the doors behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those dark, empty eyes staring into mine, like they were still there, watching me. The next morning, I woke up slumped over the kitchen table, surrounded by crumpled pieces of paper where I'd been trying to write down everything I remembered. I thought maybe if I put it all on paper, it would start making sense, but it didn't. The more I tried to write, the more the details slipped through my fingers like sand. Certain things stayed crystal clear. Her face, the sound of that hum, the burning pain on my chin when they took my blood. But everything else felt hazy, distorted. I checked myself in the mirror, hoping maybe I'd just imagined the burns, but they were still there. Small, angry red marks dotting my skin, along with dark circles under my eyes that made me look like I hadn't slept in days. My stomach churned when I noticed dirt under my fingernails and on my clothes, a reminder that I hadn't dreamed being thrown out of that craft. This was real. It had happened. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that no one would believe me. I avoided the field that day, staying inside with the curtains drawn. Every noise outside, whether it was a passing car, a bird, or the wind, made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to find some logical explanation, but there wasn't one. What I'd experienced wasn't normal. It wasn't human. At one point, I tried to call my brother to tell him what happened, but as soon as I picked up the phone, I froze. What could I even say? That I was abducted by beings from another world, that they took my blood, burned my skin, and did whatever it was they did to me. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud. Instead, I hung up and sat there staring at the wall, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The worst part wasn't even the fear. It was the helplessness, knowing that I'd been completely at their mercy, that there was nothing I could do to stop them, and that they could come back anytime they wanted. By the evening, I finally worked up the courage to go back to the field. Part of me wanted to prove to myself that it was just an isolated incident, that everything would look normal in the daylight. But when I got there, my stomach dropped. The grass where the craft had landed was scorched in a perfect oval, the earth beneath it blackened and cracked like it had been cooked from the inside out. The tools I'd dropped were scattered across the ground, bent and broken like they'd been trampled by something much heavier than a human. And then there was the smell, a sharp, metallic scent that made my nose burn and my stomach turn. It was faint, but it was there, lingering in the air like a ghost. I stood there for a long time, staring at the burnt patch of earth, trying to convince myself to go closer, to touch it, to prove to myself that it wasn't dangerous, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. It was like some part of me already knew that whatever had been here wasn't natural, and that it was better to stay away. That night the nightmares started. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back, on that slab, staring into those empty alien eyes. I could feel the cold metal under my skin, hear the hum vibrating in my skull, and see her face leaning over me. But the worst part was the sense of being trapped. Like no matter how hard I screamed or thrashed, I couldn't escape. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, only to realize that the room was pitch black and completely silent. I started sleeping with the lights on after that, but it didn't help much. The dreams kept coming, each one more vivid than the last, and I began dreading the moment my body would give out and force me to sleep. During the day, I was too tired to think straight, but my mind kept replaying fragments of the experience. Her touch, the burns, the way those beings seemed to communicate without saying a word. It was like they'd left an imprint in my brain, something I couldn't erase even if I wanted to. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things, small changes that didn't make sense. My appetite was gone completely, and even the smell of food made me nauseous. My skin felt off, like it was too sensitive, and sometimes I'd get these sharp pains in my joints that would come out of nowhere. But the strangest thing was the noise. Late at night when the house was quiet, I'd hear this faint humming, almost identical to the one I'd heard inside the craft. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just my brain playing tricks on me. But one night, I followed the sound to the field. I stood there, barefoot in the damp grass, staring at that burnt patch of earth as the hum grew louder in my ears. It wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from me. I could feel it vibrating in my chest, faint but steady, like the echo of something they'd left behind. I ran back to the house and locked the door, but even then, I could still feel it, humming softly beneath my skin. By the end of the week, I was losing it. I hadn't told anyone what had happened, and I couldn't bring myself to go into town. I knew people would ask questions, why I looked so pale, why I was trembling all the time, and I didn't have answers. My burns were starting to fade, but the memories weren't. Every time I looked at myself in the mirror, I felt like I wasn't entirely me anymore. It's hard to explain, but I felt different, like a part of me had been altered, in a way I couldn't see but could feel deep down. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself that maybe I was just traumatized and paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they'd done to me wasn't over. I started leaving the lights on in every room, checking the windows and doors constantly, like that would make a difference if they came back. The worst part was knowing that they could. They'd taken me once without warning, without reason, and nothing was stopping them from doing it again. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The humming faded, the burns healed, and the nightmares began to lose their edge. It didn't feel like relief, though. It felt like the calm before a storm, like they'd done whatever they came to do and moved on, leaving me to pick up the pieces. To this day, I still don't know why they chose me or what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up with that same feeling I had in the field, the sense of being watched, of not being alone. And even though it's been years, I still can't look at the stars the same way. What used to feel beautiful and distant now feels cold and threatening, like they're out there, waiting. Maybe they'll never come back. Or maybe they will, and next time, I won't be so lucky. I guess that's the worst part of all, knowing that there's something out there, something bigger and more powerful than us, and realizing there's nothing we can do to stop it. Second story. I tried to escape, but they found me, 1977, Colares, Para. I never thought something like this could happen to me, but now, every time I close my eyes, I see that light. It was a hot night in September 1977, and as usual, I was Sitting on the porch of my house in Collars, staring at the sky. The stars had always been a comforting presence, but that night something felt off. The lights appeared out of nowhere. At first they were small, almost like unusually bright stars, but within minutes they started moving in ways I had never seen before. Quick, abrupt stops, then darting across the sky. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination or maybe some kind of military aircraft, but then one of those lights dropped lower, hovering just above my house. The glow was so intense it lit up everything around me, making the night as bright as day. My body froze. I could feel a strange vibration in the air, like something was humming deep inside my chest. Suddenly, a bluish beam shot out from the thing and hit my shoulder. I tried to move, to run, to scream, anything, but I couldn't. It was like every ounce of strength had been drained from my body in an instant. The light wasn't hot like fire, but I felt a deep burning sensation, something that went beyond my skin, as if it was reaching inside me. A loud buzzing filled my ears, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out right there. When the light finally disappeared, my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, feeling weaker than I ever had before. The only thing I could do was look at my arm, and there it was, a swollen red circle, like something had sucked the life out of me. A wave of dizziness hit me, my vision blurred, and I remember crawling inside the house, locking the door behind me as if that could keep whatever it was from getting to me again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my living room, clutching my aching shoulder, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the morning, when I finally got the courage to step outside, I found other neighbors talking about the lights. A woman who lived a few houses down said her son had been hit by one of those beams, and ever since, he'd been weak and pale, like he was sick. Another man told us he saw the lights hovering above the trees, almost like they were looking for someone. Fear spread through the town, and that's when people started calling the attacks Chupa Chupa. I wanted to believe it was just some exaggerated rumor, but when I went to the local health clinic, the doctor looked at my wound with a serious expression and asked if I had lost any blood. I didn't know how to answer, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with me. Over the next few days, things only got worse. More and more people were showing up with the same strange burns, the same stories of feeling drained and weak after being hit by those beams. Some had marks on their necks, others on their arms or legs, and all of them described the same eerie sensation, that deep, unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate through their entire bodies. At night, nobody wanted to go outside anymore. People started barricading their windows with wood and blankets, hoping to block out the light, but it didn't seem to make any difference. The lights still came, hovering over rooftops, darting through the sky like they were searching for something, or someone. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the dogs barking in the distance and wondering if tonight would be the night they came back for me. The fear was suffocating, an endless cycle of exhaustion and paranoia that I couldn't escape from. Then one night, it happened again. I was inside this time, doors locked, windows covered, but that didn't matter. The room lit up in an instant, a bright, piercing glow that seeped through every crack. My heart sank as I felt the same vibration in the air, that low, buzzing frequency that seemed to pulse in my bones. Before I could react, the beam shot through the window, straight at me. I couldn't move. My whole body felt paralyzed, locked in place like I was being held down by something I couldn't see. The burning sensation came back, but this time it was stronger, spreading through my chest and down my arms. I could feel my strength fading, like it was being pulled out of me bit by bit. My vision darkened at the edges, and for a moment, I thought I was dying. When the beam finally disappeared, I collapsed to the floor, shaking, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. My legs felt like jelly, and I couldn't stand for what felt like hours. The next morning I could barely function. My entire body ached, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw new marks, small, red punctures around my collarbone. I knew I had to do something, but what? The authorities weren't helping. The few people who had reported their experiences were either laughed at or ignored. But then, rumors started circulating that the military had arrived on the island. People said they were watching the skies, taking notes, even taking pictures of the lights. Some folks thought they were here to protect us, while others whispered that they knew more than they were letting on. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. The lights weren't going away, and we were all running out of options. The fear in the town was reaching a breaking point, and I could feel it pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake off. As the days passed, the island felt like it was suffocating under a cloud of fear and paranoia. People were packing, up and leaving in the middle of the night, entire families disappearing without a word. Those of us who stayed behind were trapped in a constant state of dread, waiting for the lights to come back. Every night was the same, dogs barking, whispers in the dark, and that eerie glow appearing on the horizon. I stopped sleeping entirely, too afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. Even during the day, I felt watched. I started noticing strange things, shadowy figures moving along the edge of the forest, the sound of helicopters in the distance, and unmarked trucks driving through the dirt roads of Colares. It was like we were part of something bigger, something no one wanted to talk about. One afternoon, a couple of men in uniforms came to my house. They didn't introduce themselves, but I knew they were military. They asked me about my experience, with the lights, writing things down in their notebooks, nodding as if they already knew what I was going to say. When I showed them the marks on my shoulder and collarbone, they exchanged a look I couldn't quite read, concern maybe, or something worse. They didn't offer me any explanation, just told me to stay indoors at night and report anything unusual. As they left, I watched them walk down the dusty road, disappearing into the thick jungle. That's when I realized they weren't here to protect us. They were here to observe, to document, like we were nothing more than test subjects in some experiment we didn't sign up for. I kept thinking about what the doctor had told me, about the blood tests he had done without really explaining why. He said I was showing signs of anemia, that my iron levels were dangerously low. It didn't make sense. I was healthy before all this started, but now I felt weaker every day, like something inside me was slowly being drained away. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, the lack of sleep, but deep down I knew better. Something had happened to me that night, something I couldn't explain, and the worst part was, I wasn't the only one. Others had the same symptoms, the same strange circular wounds. Whatever those lights were, they were taking something from us, something we couldn't get back. At that point, I started noticing changes in myself, small things at first, but enough to make me question what was happening to me. My hands would shake for no reason, and I constantly felt cold. No matter how hot it was outside. My skin looked paler, almost sickly, and the dizziness would hit me at the worst moments, making it hard to even stand sometimes. I stopped eating as much because my stomach was always in knots, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me was different. I tried to talk to a few neighbors about it, but they either avoided the subject or told me to pray. Some of them had already gone to the church, hoping the priest could bless them or ward off whatever evil had come to Colares. I wasn't so sure prayers would help. Every night the lights kept coming back, and each time it felt like they were getting bolder, staying longer, almost like they knew we were helpless. One evening, just before sunset, I went down to the shore to clear my head. The ocean usually calmed me, but that day, Even the water felt different. There was this strange stillness in the air, like the whole island was holding its breath. As I stood there, staring out at the horizon, I saw it again, a light hovering, just above the water, moving slowly, almost deliberately. It wasn't like any normal aircraft. It made no sound, just floated there, pulsing with an eerie glow. My legs felt rooted to the ground, but every instinct in me screamed to run. Before I could move, the light shot straight up into the sky, disappearing in the blink of an eye. I thought I was losing my mind, but when I turned around, I saw a few other people on the beach, their faces frozen in shock. That night I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a small bag with whatever I could carry and decided to leave. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get out of Colares before it was too late. As I walked through the darkened streets, I saw the fear in people's eyes. Some stood in their doorways, watching the sky, while others huddled inside, whispering prayers. I felt guilty for leaving, but I also knew staying wasn't an option anymore. Just as I reached the edge of town, I heard a low hum in the distance. I looked up, and there it was again, another light, hovering above the treetops. My hands clenched around my bag, and for a second, I thought about running back, hiding, pretending none of this was real. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape what had happened to me. I don't remember much after that moment. One second, I was standing at the edge of town, staring at that hovering light, and the next, I was waking up in my own bed, drenched in sweat and feeling weaker than ever. I don't even know how I got back home. My clothes were dirty, like I had been crawling through the forest, and my head was pounding with the worst headache I've ever had. When I checked myself in the mirror, I found new marks, 3 small, perfectly round dots on my chest, just above my heart. Panic hit me like a wave. I knew I hadn't imagined any of it. Something had happened to me again, and this time, I couldn't even remember how or why. The worst part? I didn't tell anyone. I was too scared. Who would believe me anyway? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe I didn't want to know what had happened that night. After that, I stopped trying to fight it. I stayed inside as much as possible, avoided looking at the sky, and did my best to pretend life was normal, but it wasn't. Nothing in Colares was normal anymore. The town was quieter, emptier. People had either left or just stopped talking about it, like ignoring the lights would make them go away. The military presence grew stronger, more men in uniforms, more equipment, more secrecy. It was clear they knew something we didn't, but they weren't sharing it. One night I overheard 2 soldiers talking near the market. They mentioned extraction and containment, and that was all I needed to hear to know that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. If anything, it was getting worse. Eventually the lights stopped coming, just like that. No warning, no explanation. They were gone. The strange thing is, their absence was almost worse than their presence. At least when they were there, I knew what to expect. But now, every time I looked up at the sky, I felt like they were still watching, just waiting for the right moment to come back. My health never fully recovered, and to this day, I still get those dizzy spells and moments of weakness. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can hear that low humming sound in the distance, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free from whatever happened to me on that island. I don't tell many people about this anymore. Those who were there, who lived through it, they understand. But outsiders, they laugh, call us crazy, say we imagined it all. I don't blame them. I wish it was just a story, something we all made up to scare each other. But it wasn't. Something real happened in Colares, something none of us can explain, and no matter how much time passes, I know it's not over. Whatever those lights were, they took something from us. Our health, our peace, maybe even a part of our souls. And the scariest part, I don't think they're done yet. Sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, I still get that feeling, that deep gut-wrenching sense that they're out there somewhere, waiting, and one day they'll be back. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story, 5 hours missing, 1980, Bapendi, Minas Gerais. I never thought something like this could happen to me and my brother João. We grew up fishing in that lake, knowing every inch of it like the back of our hands. It was a night like any other, clear sky, the gentle sound of water lapping against the boat, and the occasional rustle of leaves on the shore. We had been out there for a few hours, not catching much, just enjoying the quiet. Then, out of nowhere, this bright light appeared beneath the water. At first I thought it was some kind of reflection, maybe from a flashlight or something, but it didn't move like one. It was steady, almost pulsing, and it seemed to grow brighter by the second. João saw it too, and we both sat there frozen, watching it intensify. Before we could even talk about what it might be, the light shot up from the water so fast that it felt like it sucked all the air out of my lungs. The next thing I remember is this overwhelming feeling, like something pulling me, but not physically. It was as if my whole body got lighter, almost weightless, and suddenly everything around us turned into a blinding white. I don't even remember letting go of my fishing rod. It just wasn't in my hand anymore. I tried to call out to João, but my voice wouldn't come out, like I was trapped inside myself. Then, blackness. When I came to, I was lying on a cold, metallic surface. The air smelled strange, sterile, almost like a hospital, but with a weird electric edge to it. The light wasn't as harsh anymore, but everything around me seemed to glow softly. I looked over and saw João next to me, wide-eyed, breathing heavily. Neither of us said anything, but the look on his face told me he was just as terrified as I was. We both sat up slowly, trying to make sense of where we were. The walls around us were smooth and metallic, curving in ways that didn't seem natural. There were no visible seams or joints, like the whole place was made from a single piece of material. I could hear this faint buzzing sound, like a swarm of bees far away, but it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It felt like it was all around us. And then we saw them. Small figures, no taller than a child, standing in the dim light. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their heads were too big for their bodies. They had these enormous dark eyes that seemed to stare right through us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. One of them stepped closer, and that's when I noticed its hands. Long, thin fingers that moved so precisely, like it was studying us. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was sit there, frozen, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't even process. The figures didn't seem threatening at first, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way they moved, almost mechanical, yet fluid. One of them approached me and held out a thin, metallic device. It was small, about the size of a remote control, and emitted a faint blue light. I had no idea what it was or what they wanted, but before I could think, I felt a sharp sensation on my arm, like a quick pinch. I looked down and saw a tiny needle retracting back into the device. My arm tingled, but I couldn't move it to rub the spot. João was staring at me, his eyes wide with terror. Then one of the beings turned its attention to him, holding a similar device. I could see him trying to resist, but it was like we were paralyzed, not by force, but by something I can't explain. It was as if our own bodies were betraying us, refusing to respond to our commands. I started noticing strange details about the beings. Their skin wasn't just pale, it shimmered faintly under the light, almost like it was reflecting it. Their movements were eerily synchronized, like they didn't need to speak to communicate. That buzzing sound I'd heard earlier grew louder whenever they interacted. Joan winced as they used the device on him, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I wanted to yell, to fight back, but I was utterly powerless. Then, without warning, one of the beings placed its hand over my chest. It wasn't aggressive, it was almost gentle, but the sensation was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was like a wave of energy passed through me, leaving behind a cold numbness. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to black out again. When my vision cleared, I realized they weren't just observing us. They were studying us. Another being approached, carrying what looked like a small tray with instruments I couldn't recognize. One of them was long and thin, almost like a wand, and it emitted a soft hum when activated. They used it to scan my head, stopping occasionally as if taking notes. I couldn't tell if they were communicating with each other or simply reacting in unison, but the buzzing sound persisted, almost as if it was part of their thought process. João and I locked eyes, and I could see tears streaming down his face. That's when I noticed something strange. Time didn't feel normal. Everything seemed to move both quickly and slowly, like I was stuck in a dream where minutes stretched endlessly, yet everything happened in a blur. I kept telling myself this wasn't real, that I'd wake up back on the boat. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a nightmare I could escape. At some point, I became aware of the pressure in my ears, like when you're flying and your ears won't pop. The humming from their device seemed to resonate deep inside my head, making my thoughts feel scrambled. Joan groaned, and I turned to see one of the beings examining him more closely. They had something in their hands that looked like a glass tube, and I watched in horror as they ran it along his arm. The tube filled with a dark red liquid. His blood. Joan flinched but couldn't move, his face pale as a ghost. My breathing grew shallow as panic took over. I wanted to scream, to push them away, but no matter how much I tried, I couldn't muster the strength. It was like being trapped in my own body, a prisoner to whatever was happening. Then, something even stranger happened. The beings seemed to finish their work on João and turn their focus back to me. One of them brought out another instrument, this one flat and disc-shaped, with small pulsating lights around the edges. They pressed it lightly against my chest, and I felt an intense warmth spreading through my body, like a wave of heat flowing from my chest to my limbs. It wasn't painful, but it was deeply unnatural. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, my breathing evening out, as though they were controlling my body functions. My mind was racing, though. How were they doing this? Why us? The buzzing noise grew louder again, almost deafening, and for a split second, I swore I could hear words. Not spoken aloud, but inside my head, faint and fragmented, like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, without warning, everything went dark again. When I came to, I was back on the boat. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No buzzing, no lights, just the sound of the water gently lapping against the boat. It was disorienting. 1 second, I was in that strange metallic room, and the next, we were sitting in the middle of the lake, as if nothing had happened. João was slumped over beside me, his breathing shallow but steady. My head was spinning, and my whole body felt heavy, like I'd just run a marathon. I glanced at my arm where they'd taken the sample, and there it was, a small red mark, like a pinprick, surrounded by faint bruising. João had similar marks on his arm and neck. We sat there in stunned silence for what felt like forever, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until I checked my watch that I realized something was very wrong. My watch said it was just after 3 a.m., but the last time I'd looked at it, before everything started, it was around 10 p.m. We had lost nearly 5 hours. João noticed it too, and his face went pale. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know if I could speak. My throat felt dry, like I'd been screaming silently for hours. We both sat there, staring at the calm water, as if expecting the light to reappear. But the lake was completely still, almost unnervingly so. No fish jumping, no insects buzzing, just an eerie, unnatural quiet. I looked up at the sky, hoping to see some sign, but it was just as empty and quiet as the lake below. We decided to head back to the village, even though every muscle in my body screamed for rest. The journey back was surreal. Neither of us spoke much, and the oars cutting through the water sounded louder than ever in the stillness. My mind kept replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of it. Were we dreaming? Hallucinating? But the marks on our bodies said otherwise. When we finally reached the shore, we were too shaken to even pull the boat out of the water properly. We just left it there, grabbed our gear, and stumbled back to our small house. The village was silent, everyone asleep, and that only added to the surreal feeling, like we'd been gone for much longer than just a few hours. Once inside, I finally broke down. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely light the lantern. João sat at the table, staring blankly at his arms where the marks were still visible. "What were they?" he whispered, more to himself than to me. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that what we had experienced wasn't something from this world. We tried to piece together the timeline, but everything felt disjointed. How could 5 hours pass in what felt like minutes? Why did they take us? And what had they done to us? I noticed a faint metallic taste in my mouth and wondered if that was part of whatever tests they ran. Neither of us slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those large black eyes staring into my soul. The next morning, the village seemed oblivious to what we had gone through. People greeted us as they always did, talking about the weather and asking about our fishing trip. João and I exchanged uneasy glances, silently agreeing not to mention anything. How could we explain it without sounding insane? But as the day went on, I started noticing the little things. My body ached in ways I couldn't explain, like I'd been bruised all over, though there were no visible signs apart from the marks. João complained of a constant headache that wouldn't go away, and we both felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, like our energy had been drained. Worse, every time we talked about what had happened, the metallic taste in my mouth grew, stronger, as if it were tied to the memory itself. Over the next few days, strange things kept happening. João woke up one morning with a small triangle-shaped mark on his wrist that hadn't been there before. It looked almost like a burn, but didn't hurt when touched. I started having vivid dreams, if you could even call them that, where I was back in that metallic room, unable to move, surrounded by those beings. In the dreams, they weren't just observing me. They were trying to communicate, but not in words. It was more like flashes of images and emotions, things I couldn't fully comprehend. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and the taste of metal lingering on my tongue. João said he was having similar dreams, though he refused to talk about them in detail. It was like the more we tried to forget, the more the experience clung to us. A few weeks after the incident, we finally broke our silence and told an older fisherman in the village, someone we trusted deeply. His reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of laughing or calling us crazy, he grew quiet and nodded slowly. He told us that others had seen strange lights over the lake before, though no one ever talked about it openly. Some said it was just superstition, But now, hearing our story, he wasn't so sure. Word spread quickly, and soon, ufologists from nearby towns came to interview us. We told them everything, but I don't think anyone truly understood what we'd been through. It wasn't just the abduction itself, it was the aftermath, the way it changed us. Even now, I still feel like a part of me never really came back from that place. Life eventually returned to some version of normal, but João and I never went back to that lake. We couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I felt a deep, gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. The marks on our bodies faded with time, but the memories didn't. I still don't have answers to what happened that night, and maybe I never will. All I know is that something out there, something far beyond our understanding, took us, studied us, and then left us as suddenly as they appeared. Sometimes I wonder if they're still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And, on quiet nights when the world seems too still, I swear I can hear that faint buzzing sound again, like a distant hum just out of reach. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.